Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's great to have you back for another installment of Intermodal Analyzed with Larry Gross to guide us through the numbers, take us on a walk through the what's happened and what might happen. Before we get started, I want to say a special thank you to our gold sponsors. They support us year long. They do a heck of a lot for us. This session in particular, they are supporting, so thank you to all of them. With that, I am going to turn it over to my friend Larry and have him kick us off today with a little intro and then and jump into what's happening. So Larry, over to you, my friend.
Well, thanks, Hal, and thanks to you and the IANA team for giving me the opportunity once again to chat with the audience here and go through some of the latest data that IANA and others produces on the intermodal side. So with that, here's my contact info. If you have questions after the seminar and want to reach out after the webinar, you can reach me. I tweet. I'm on Twitter at Intermodalist. You got my email there and my telephone number. I would look forward to talking to you. So with that, let me kill the camera so you get a full view of the slide, and let's get going here. So I write a monthly column for the Journal of Commerce. The gentleman at the Journal of Commerce who edits my column, Mark Ciccone, is always chiding me because my first draft, I usually bury the lead. And by that, being sort of a data-driven guy, I like to build up the case for a certain conclusion and then present the conclusion. But from a journalistic standpoint, that's not really necessarily the best approach. And the idea is to tell folks at the outset what the big story is and then backfill. And so that's what I'm going to do here today, is start off with what I think is the headline. And that is that we have recut the numbers both for second quarter, and we now have the numbers for third quarter for intermodal market share. And based on what we're seeing right now, these are, of course, tentative numbers and subject to some change when things are happening just as fast as they seem to be unfolding at the moment. We've seen a historic surge in intermodal market share over the last 2 quarters. And that is certainly a difference from where we thought the second quarter was during the first cut when things were changing so fast. And the intermodal numbers aren't changing. We know what those are, but when we look at what the overall long haul truck numbers are, those are derived. And I work with my good friend, a very well-known transportation economist, Noel Perry, who produces these truck numbers, and they are derived from what's going on with the economy and a lot of other things that have been changing at seemingly supersonic speed. But what it now appears is that intermodal share began to recover after the low point of 2019 Q4, a very modest gain in Q1, and then as the pandemic began to hit, things really began to change. And you can see that here with this yellow line with the tremendous increase from Q1 to Q2, and then a significant but smaller increase coming here into Q3. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at that, and you see 13.2%, which is a record number based on this analysis of intermodal share of long haul truck movements of dry vans and reefer. And by long haul, we're defining that in this case as 500 miles or greater between origin and destination. So where did this number come from? Well, if you break the intermodal up into the domestic and international or IPI sectors, IPI on the right, international and domestic on the left in green, you can see that most of the horsepower was supplied by the domestic side of intermodal house. With tremendous increases, again, to record levels in terms of domestic market share. And by that, just to define this is that portion of the market share that's accounted for by intermodal movements of domestic equipment, revenue moves. And we're not seeing anything close to that on the IPI side of the house. In fact, share is lower than it was historically, although we have seen a little bit of a recovery in Q2, we gave some of that back in Q3. Domestic overall truck activity was growing faster than IPI during that period. So let's put this into a long-term context. And this is domestic market share for as long as we have the data which goes all the way back to the year 2000. Each of those little squares is 1 quarter's worth of data. And this really shows you the broad sweep of what has happened with regard to domestic intermodal. The market share sort of puttered along during the first half of the aughts until we got to the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, and that ushered in what you could call a golden age of intermodal in terms of domestic share gain. And you could see that sort of quite steady progression that began in 2009 and continued all the way up to about the beginning of 2014 and even a little bit into 2015. And then you saw I'll say a leveling off of share from 2015 through about the early part of 2018. That ever increasing share trend stopped. And then we saw a bump up in 2018. That was purely a result of the capacity shortage on the over-the-road side that was stemming from the ELD mandate and the hours of service changes. That peaked in about the middle of 2018, and then we saw a quite steady and significant decline in share that went through about the middle of 2019. And that was both considerable loosening on the over-the-road side, as well as the changes that were wrought on the intermodal network as a result of the onset of the precision scheduled railroading mantra and what that did in terms of simplifying the intermodal network and closure of secondary lanes, steel wheel transfer, and secondary terminals. And so then we get to 2020, and you can just see the magnitude of that recent increase, which dwarfs any moves that we have seen to date. So the interesting question, which we'll get to a little bit later, I think, is whether or not this surge is sustainable, and how much of this is going to be retained when conditions return to normal. And I'll put that term in normal in quotes, because undoubtedly at the end of all of this, it will be some sort of a new normal. So with that headline out of the way, let's do our normal routine here and look at what's happening with regard to the IANA data, the ETSO database, equipment type, size, and ownership, which every month allows us to take a close look at what's happening with regard to intermodal revenue movements. On the left, you see the monthly moves, with blue being international ISO containers or IPI, inland point intermodal, 20s, 40s, and 45s. The green line is domestic equipment, domestic containers, 53-footers, and TUFC of all types. And then the red line, which keys off of the left-hand axis, is total intermodal revenue movements. You can see that the domestic side bottomed earlier, recovered earlier, but now we're starting to see some real good recovery on the international side as well. And if you look at the table on the right, you can see that starting off there, we saw a 2.7% increase from August to September. And now for the first time, we've moved into the black in terms of the year-over-year comparison, with a gain of a modest gain, but a gain nonetheless at 2.9%. If we turn to the trailer side of things, the TUFC side of things, that's the only red that's on this chart, is short trailers, which declined fractionally from August to September. I believe that's the second such decline, just very small, basically a leveling out. The year-over-year gain, of course, is still extremely significant, almost 16%. But what that starts to say is that some of the impetus that we saw earlier in terms of the tremendous increase in e-commerce, which was some of that was moving in trailers. Not to say it's gone away, it's still there. You could see that in the 53-foot and short trailer year-over-year comparisons, but it looks like things are starting to flatten out in terms of any additional incremental growth that's happening. So, you know, for instance, we saw in the short trailer category, which is everything 48 feet and shorter, we saw the seasonal surge fleet of 48-foot equipment, which normally only gets deployed in the late October, November, December timeframe. we saw that fleet being deployed in the summer. And now that fleet is fully deployed. That's where some of this growth is coming from in the short trailer category. But there's going to be no additional growth there because the fleet is already completely put to work. On the domestic container side, moving further down the chart here, 1.9% month over month on the private side. On the rail side, we saw a quite significant increase incrementally of almost 5%, that they were able to squeeze additional productivity out of the existing container, the rail-owned domestic container fleet. And that's what's going to have to happen here in order to see additional growth from here on out, is we're going to have to see more productivity or quicker turns on the equipment, because I don't think we're going to see a lot of equipment flowing into the fleet, new equipment. There was a very moderate amount of new equipment ordered, and that's all pretty well been delivered from my understanding. So in terms of any future growth would have to come from productivity, because I think the fleet is fully utilized. And you can see that in terms of these really remarkable year-over-year increases, particularly for the rail domestic container. Now I do want to caution, when you look at these outside year-over-year numbers, you always have to keep two things in mind. One is what's happening now, and the second is, well, gee, what happened a year ago? And if you go back and look at last September, it was not a great month for domestic container. So that some of this increase that we see in the year-over-year numbers is telling us more about last year than this year. So I would expect to see, come the October figures, it wouldn't surprise me at all to see a retreat in terms of the overall year-over-year increases. That doesn't necessarily mean volume is actually dropping this year. It just means potentially that the comparison got a little bit tougher. In a normal world, we would expect to see volume, domestic volume, top out here in October, and on the IPI side, probably things, normally speaking, would see a decline. August, September typically being the peak months for that segment of the market. Not sure what we're going to see. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a bit in terms of this peak season. So here is a little bit of color on the domestic container side, and you can see in red the rail-owned fleet and what happened there during the course of the lockdown and the recovery, as well as the green is the private fleet. Now the red is roughly rail-owned containers, roughly 1/3 of the North American domestic container fleet, the remaining 2/3 being accounted for by private ownership. That would be people that could range from FedEx, UPS, Amazon, Walmart, Schneider, Hunt, Hub, Robinson, etc. Those are all private fleets. And then the rail fleet would be your EMPs, your CSX units, UMAX units, as well as the Canadians, Canadian National, Canadian Pacific. If you look at the extreme right-hand side of this right chart, you can see that nice bump up that rail domestic container experienced in terms of moves per working day. And this is an index chart, this chart on the right. So if we look at the 2016 average revenue moves per working day, we set that as an index of 100. So this tells you what's happened since 2016, and you can see that there was a tremendous divergence in the private and rail fleet, even as, you know, the earliest that this chart shows you, which is October 2019, rail revenue moves per working day, rail-owned containers, was actually lower than they were on average in 2016, whereas privates were considerably higher. And in fact, only in the most recent month have revenue movements in rail-owned containers moved above the 2016 average. So there has been quite a bit of erosion, which now is potentially beginning to be made up in just the last couple of months. We're starting to see some movement there. If we look at the AAR weekly numbers, that will tell us what's happening here, starting to tell us what's happening here in October. The yellow line in the case of the left-hand chart, this is North American revenue moves per week. And so we're looking there at what's happening sequentially. And what you can see is that since about the beginning of October, we've now got, 3 weeks in. It looks like things have kind of leveled out here a little bit in terms of growth. The year-over-year comparison, which are those red bars, is still increasing, but sequentially, it looks like to me we may be in the process of topping out here. Be interesting to see when the numbers come out tomorrow. Typically, I put out a flash report to the subscribers to my publication, Intermodal in Depth, and that's what we're looking for. There is are we seeing additional sequential growth, or are we going to continue to see things flatten out, or even at some point here over the next few weeks, we might start to see, I'll call it a seasonal decline. Now, when we look at the North American numbers, of course, they're really composed of three components: US, Canada, and Mexico. And we break those out here. On the right-hand side is the US numbers in blue, and you could see the year-over-year gain actually a little bit more for the US than it is for North America in total. And those are quite remarkable year-over-year increases, over 11% in the most recent week and 8% over the last 4 weeks, which are quite remarkable, I think, given the damage that's been done to the US economy. Certainly, we are experiencing, I guess you could say, a perfect storm, a perfect favorable storm right now with regard to intermodal, because all of the winds are tailwinds at this point in terms of the particulars. Looking at Canada and Mexico, we've seen actually Canada was late to the game in terms of the recovery, but the recovery has been very strong and actually has continued right up to the most recent week. So that has enabled it to really come very close to what the US numbers were in terms of the year-over-year for the first time in many, many, many weeks. Now, the Mexico situation is the difficult one. You can see very significant year-over-year deficits. At least the big contributor to this is something that has nothing to do with intermodal or freight, but political protests that are occurring in Mexico. And they found that blocking rail lines is an effective way of getting people's attention. And so this has become kind of a chronic issue for the Mexican railroads with line blockages, teachers, and other social protests that just involve the railroads and impede the free flow of commerce as a way of generating political pressure. So it's difficult from afar to parse how much of the decline, the deficit that we're seeing year over year is due to that issue versus, let's say, other broader issues with regard to the Mexican economy, as well as intermodal's performance in particular. See if we can get, there we go. So here's the situation with regard to imports. The blue line is North American import TEUs by month. The yellow line is exports by month, and the red line, keying off the left-hand side, is total TEUs handled in and out. North America, in this case, is defined as all major US ports plus the Western Canadian ports. We don't have data on a monthly basis from the Eastern Canadian ports, although we sure would like to have it if they were to report that. So you can see, first of all, the headline being that it looks like TEUs, import TEUs, which we have through September, began to tail off just a little bit after the very rapid rise, 2-month rise that we saw beginning in the month of June. It came up, then very sharp rise in July, and a lesser but still significant rise in August, slight decline in September. And if you look at the year-over-year numbers, which is the blue bars on the chart at right, there's some very significant increases year-over-year in the last 2 months. Now, I wish I could say the same thing for the yellow line, which is exports, but no such luck. The export numbers, we are a month behind typically imports, so we only have those through August at this point on a comprehensive basis, but really seeing no signs of any particular recovery there, and still double digit in August, double digit deficit versus prior year. And as a result, if you can just see that the gap between the blue and the yellow line on the left-hand chart, showing that we've become quite significantly more imbalanced right now in terms of imports, TEUs, loaded revenue TEUs versus exports. So real sharp recovery on imports, no such sign on exports. The other question is, where is this stuff moving? And I started to talk last month about maybe we were starting to see a little bit of a movement away from that concentration on LA Long Beach that we had previously seen during the recovery. And it looks like that was probably a little bit premature because we saw a very significant sequential gain from July to August for East Coast ports, but that kind of petered out here in September. And you can see that by looking at these month-to-month numbers. North America down about 1.6%, as we said, but LA Long Beach still chugging away, actually showing a little bit of an increase, 1.4%, but a very significant year-over-year gain and of 18%. Folks are still trying to squeeze through what I call that keyhole, that LA Long Beach keyhole, in the belief that that is the fastest way to the market, which normally I think it is. The problem is when everybody tries to squeeze through at the same time, that calculus becomes disrupted. And that seems to be the situation right now. We're just seeing a lot of congestion, chassis issues, terminal handling issues, port issues, where all of this volume is starting to become quite disrupted. So if the goal is to get to market quickest, it's not necessarily being achieved, which is the problem when all the BCOs act as of one mind. The Northern California situation, we're seeing a decline, and I always like to look at what happens in Northern Cal, which is basically Oakland, because that's more of a local port. Of all of these different port regions, that's the one that kind of, I think, has the least inland reach, and so tells us something about what's happening with regard to overall economic demand, at least within that market. And it looks like that market has largely been satisfied, and volume is starting to trail off. You can see a 2.5% decline, even though the year-over-year is still in the double-digit levels. The region with the largest gain in terms of sequential gain in September was the Pacific Northwest, CTAC in particular, 4.7%, which looks great, is great, but in terms of their longer run picture, you see that extremely significant deficit versus prior years. So they're still got a big deep hole that they need to dig out of, and they made some progress in September, but there is surely a long way to go. What is interesting is the divergence in September between the PNW and the arch rival Western Canadian ports, which had been outperforming but didn't do so in the month of September, with a fairly significant month-over-month decline. Although if you look at the year-over-year number, far better than PNW, but it's something that bears watching. We talked about the East Coast, so we see basically a flat picture for the Northeast, but a very significant year-over-year increase, second only to LA Long Beach. But the big surprise was the big decline that occurred in Southeastern import TEUs, almost a 9% decline, and that knocked the year-over-year gain down significantly, which was not the case in the situation with the Gulf Coast ports, which still saw an increase, and they're turning in a year-over-year performance roughly the same as the Northeast. So if we look at the U.S. West Coast share, which is this right-hand chart, it started down in August, but then there was a reversal, and so we're still seeing what I would term, at least in terms of the last 12 months average, a superior share performance, which has now lasted, probably I'd say 4 months. The average of the last 12 months being represented by that dashed yellow line. And if you look all the way over to the left-hand side of that chart, you can see that we're a little bit ahead in terms of a West Coast market share, U.S. West Coast, than we were a year ago. Drayage situation is a tale of two cities, in effect. We are seeing generally quiet conditions with three markets in particular in basically a state of meltdown, and those markets are New York, Memphis, and LA. And in the case of LA, what the drayage demand index measures is the number of clicks looking for work, looking for drayage capacity that are seen by our by drayage.com, which is our good friend Jason Hilsenbeck, and he provides those click numbers to me every week, and we compare those to the sort of the long-term average of clicks per day that we have seen in the market. And typically we're saying if you're seeing above twice as many clicks or more in a particular market looking for capacity, that's probably a pretty good indication that the market is getting very tight. Well, I can tell you that in the most recent week that I looked at in LA, that number was 718. Now, I don't even know how to interpret that other than I don't think there's a tremendous difference in reality between a number of 400 and a number of 700. It just indicates that things are really out of whack. And we're not seeing that magnitude of problem in the other two areas, Memphis and New York, but still very, very significant numbers, well into the 300s, indicating that those markets are also very difficult. But very unusually compared to with our limited experience, we've only been doing this about 2 years. It's really unusual to see such isolated instances which are not reflected in the overall. If you look at the rest of those locations, green and blue, and they're indicating generally pretty quiet conditions, lots of available capacity, not a lot of clicking occurring. So an unusual situation right now with regard to the drayage. Train speeds are telling a pretty good story. If you look at this red line, which is 2020 average intermodal train speeds as reported by the railroads to the U.S. Surface Transportation Board. We've seen an increase in the average speed over the last few weeks, about a 3.3% improvement versus the 5-year average, which is, that's that lighter blue line, about a mile an hour better, and about the same with regard to prior year. Now, this is a very limited statistic. It only tells us how well the trains are running once they get out of the terminal. It doesn't tell us what happens with regard to terminal delays on either end. It doesn't tell us about freight that's supposed to make given train A and gets rolled to train B. And there's lots of anecdotes out there that indicate that those are issues right now. So, this is unfortunately the only statistic that we have that we can track. Other statistics are not made publicly available by the railroads. So I don't want to paint. I mean, this picture, as far as it goes, is a good one, but it's an incomplete picture. So just to try and sum up here, in terms of what we're seeing so far, I mean, I'd say the stars have really aligned during this recovery in favor of intermodal. We're seeing still, fairly significant reductions in overall demand for long-haul trucking, probably about 10%, as I recall, in Q3, 10% reduction year over year. But what has, in effect, served in intermodal's favor is that the reductions in industry capacity have been greater than that. So as we've seen a much more modest recovery in demand for trucking services, over-the-road trucking services, that has collided with this reduction in capacity, and that's what's resulting in significant tightness on the over-the-road side, which is evidenced by the action that we're seeing in the spot rate market, which has been quite volatile towards the upside. Although in the very most recent couple of weeks, looks like things are starting to at least stabilize, if not even begin to cool off a little bit, which is what we would normally expect to see in terms of seasonal activity. But that has resulted in significant pressure on the intermodal side. We've seen the overall depletion of the supply chains as a result of the pandemic in China, and then the lockdowns here, and all of that needed to be restocking. As I said last week, I think this is true with our ability to spend money on experiences like dining out and sports events and theater and all those other nice things that are part of life that have now been constrained. Those of us that have money are directing it more towards goods, especially trying to spruce up the homes that we're spending so much time in these days. And that has resulted in these very heavy import flows. And because intermodal is disproportionately affected by imports, which international, if you put transloading together, probably accounts for roughly 2/3 of all intermodal activity. When that sector outperforms, well, that's going to benefit intermodal disproportionately. And then trying to run everything through the most intermodal friendly routings, which are through LA Long Beach, has also helped intermodal significantly. So where to on peak season? I think that with regard to domestic, we achieved peak levels in September. And to go any further beyond that here, normally we would expect to see peak in October. But if everything is fully utilized, all the boxes are full and turning as fast as they can, then it seems like additional incremental growth is going to be difficult. So then the question shifts to whether we will see the normal kind of decline that we would typically begin to see on the case of IPI, even coming off of August. Typically August, then a decline in September, a little bit of a bump up in October, and then further decline going all the way through the balance of the year. We may not see that pattern this year. I think it's likely that we might see things stay stronger longer. And so in terms of the year-over-year comparisons, even though we may not necessarily see any sequential growth, if it just hangs in there, then the year-over-year comparisons will expand, because normally we would be seeing a decline at this time of year. And the reports, the anecdotal reports, are that the Trans-Pacific volumes are still looking to be strong. Everybody's saying there's still a strong October. If the domestic container fleet is fully utilized, then the only outlet for inland movement at that point is IPI, or inland point intermodal or international. Now, the ocean carriers have been trying to discourage inland movement of ISO containers because the eastbound rates are so strong right now across the Pacific that what they really want to do is unload that ISO box, get it back on a ship and back over to Asia just as fast as they possibly can, because they are also equipment constrained in Asia. In fact, as I understand it right now, the new container capacity is sold out. I think until sometime in mid 2021 is where I think I saw that. So the ocean carriers are loath to allow their containers to take an inland tour, which is going to result in very little upside revenue for them, then probably, given the weak state of export loadings, an empty return, and then get back to China. So they'll have foregone a lucrative eastbound move in return for not very much benefit. So they're going to try and continue to incent people to turn that ISO box, if possible, at the coast, and find some other way of getting the goods inland. I will mention one other item here. The numbers are quite unusually divergent for 40s and 20s. 20s certainly are not moving inland to any degree compared to the 40s, which are seeing where most of the growth is, which has big implications for those heavy loading export commodities, because 20-foot capacity is going to become even more difficult to come by at these inland locations. So lots and lots going on, lots of moving parts. So where to from here? You know, there's not a lot of change between this slide and what I put up last month. Certainly the news on the virus, which underlies everything, is not good right now. Of course, as the temperatures drop, it was 19 degrees here in Durango this morning. I don't think we're going to be barbecuing today, and we won't be meeting folks outside on our patio like we have been. And to the extent that folks are becoming pandemic fatigued, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal on that this morning. It's going to be a tough winter, I suspect, and that will have economic consequences. Vaccine efforts are on track, but we won't really see effects of that until, in my opinion, the middle of next year, and that's an optimistic one. A lot of the strength that we've seen in the economy up till now, the resilience, I'll call it, has been a function of federal economic support, which was quite generous during the early parts of the pandemic. And now it appears that it's extremely unlikely that we'll see anything happen until certainly until after the election, and maybe until after January, when the new government, whatever it looks like, is in place. Hiring has been on a bit of an increase. We're about halfway back from the worst, but it doesn't look like necessarily we're seeing a lot of forward momentum at this point, with, I'd say, a lot of potential downside in terms of foreclosures and small businesses that have been hanging on by their fingernails through the summer, but now will they be able to survive, let's call it a difficult winter. And then I hear there's a minor election here in a week or so. Who knows what that's going to entail? You know, I'm the resident curmudgeon. I'm still, I'd say my concerns are more on the downside. But as I have previously stated, I didn't see the V-shaped recovery that Intermodal experienced coming. So you can take that for what it's worth, my predictions. So with that, Hal, I think that ties it up. I do want to give a plug both for my monthly analytical report. If you really want to get deep into it, this is about a 40-page report that comes out every month, plus the flash updates. And we would love to have you as a subscriber. And then we have the Intermodal Volume Analyzer, which puts the full power of the IANA ETSO database at your fingertips. And both of those I recommend with regard to folks that really want to understand what's happening in the intermodal arena. So with that, Hal, I'll turn it back over to you, and hopefully we've got some questions teed up to make the best use of our remaining time. And as always, I thank you for the opportunity to chat with the audience.
Absolutely, Larry. It's always great to have you back. We've got some good questions rolling in. We've got a couple of just sort of structural ones, sort of, educational ones. And some of it revolves around the surge fleet. And I think some people were like, what is this surge fleet you speak of? If you could touch on the surge fleet a little bit and just kind of how that works. Please.
Sure. So when we look at the normal trend, seasonal trend in parcel movements, we see a tremendous increase during the late holiday season, from Thanksgiving through the holidays, maybe a little bit before that. Normally speaking, that number really takes a jump up. And certainly UPS, I know, maintains a fleet of 48-foot trailers, for the most part, ex-QFC trailers. And in fact, believe it or not, there's some neutered road railer trailers in there, which is one of the reasons why I first became familiar with it. And those trailers are deployed at strategic locations around the country and kept in a sort of a ready to roll condition, but with the intent that they only are utilized for a few months a year. And so typically you can see that those are basically the only 48 footers that are moving in QFC these days. And the monthly volume, if you look at the ETSO data, the monthly volume typically on 48s is extremely low. And then in a normal year, you start to see that really pick up as the parcel carriers pull these equipped units out of the bullpen and put them into service to handle the normal holiday surge. You see a big ramp up in that activity, which lasts until basically the turn of the year, and then things quiet down over January and into February as that equipment gets folded back out of the fleet and gets parked for the next year. So the unusual thing is the equipment was sitting there, and all of a sudden the parcel carriers saw basically Christmas in July in terms of their activity. Well, there was this capacity domestic. They soaked up, at least anecdotally, I don't know this for a fact, they soaked up every rail-owned container out there. That's why there was such a shortage of rail-owned container capacity, because the big parcel users needed them to move. They needed that capacity, and then they also used all of their existing QFC capacity. Plus, you saw a real jump in 53-foot capacity, 53-foot QFC as well. That was all being driven, I think, to a great extent by what was happening on the e-commerce, and a lot of that moving in the form of parcel moves, which is extremely unusual for July and August. That's why that was such a strange deal. So I hope that answers that question.
No, that's great. This is a good one, because it definitely, I've scratched my head a little bit on this one, but how much longer before the TEU size intermodal box goes fundamentally away, replaced by quoting everything in FEU, physical units?
We're talking about this, even though TEUs, 20-foot containers, are declining as a percentage, there's still a significant, a very significant piece of the overall international trade puzzle. Probably, I'd have to go back and look. I'm guessing they're probably about 20%. I might actually have this here. I have that open. So, well, I can tell you that, okay, here it is. In September, 20-footers accounted for 18.9% of all IPI. And 40-footers were 79%, and 45-footers were 2%. So that gives you some idea, but there's no doubt in my mind that 20-footers, although I don't have that data, the 20-footers that are on the ocean is a much higher percentage. Those units just aren't moving inland right now. So I'm going to guess that it's got to be at least a quarter of what's happening in terms of moves. If you measure it in terms of TEUs, then 40-footers are a much bigger percentage. In terms of how it's quoted, I guess I don't have an opinion on that. It's beyond my realm of expertise.
Fair enough. To be continued. Maybe we'll track that and run a poll and see if people want to change the nomenclature. Here's a good one. Larry, does the increased transloading of IPI traffic to domestic containers skew the intermodal truck share stat?
Absolutely. It's, we can't distinguish. I mean, we have sort of backdoor ways of distinguishing how much of the domestic is transloading. And my best guess is the transloading off of the Southern Cal is about 15% of all domestic intermodal activity, most recently, a little higher than that. But if that intermodal option wasn't available, that stuff would be moving by truck most likely. So I mean, I think it's a fully legitimate piece of the domestic share. But to answer the question directly, yes, it absolutely has a direct effect on that domestic piece and its share of overall truck activity.
Here's one about inland movement and its potential impact on recovery. It says, if there are no boxes moving inland, how will the U.S. recover in the first half of 21, particularly the first quarter?
The answer is that if you're going to have an export load, you need to have an empty box. Now, the availability of empty export capacity is always a chronic issue, because typically two reasons. One is that even when volume is flowing inland, typically it's flowing towards large population centers where the import goods are being consumed, but the export goods are not being generated in those locations. They're typically low, a lot of agricultural commodities and other sort of low rated commodities that are being generated in remote locations. So the capacity needs to be moved from point A to point B, and there's no revenue associated with that. Then the problem is that the revenue associated with the export load is typically very, very low. Now, these export loads, I mean, it's still a significant piece of the value of the load, because the load itself is, well, it could be something like waste paper, which has very, very low value per box load anyway. So that's not to say it's not significant to the exporter, but in terms of the economics of moving that piece of equipment around, there's not enough juice in that westbound export revenue per box to the carrier to support a lot of inland movement. So the problem is always that the folks are saying, I don't have enough capacity in export location A. There's plenty of capacity in B, but nobody wants to pay to move it. And from a ocean carrier standpoint, the cost of repositioning that box to a remote location is probably about the same as getting it back to the coast empty. And so from equipment utilization standpoint, especially if equipment supplies remain tight, that becomes kind of a no-brainer for them. So it's potentially a significant issue that is going to persist for quite some time, I think, that for exporters, particularly inland exporters, locating capacity and getting that volume, getting that those export goods out to the coast is going to be a challenge, and it may become a constraint.
Here's one that we can maybe kind of just piggyback on that because it's definitely related, and it's around trade war. And could a change in the administration, and the assumption is maybe that some of the trade policies change, could that result in improvements for exports? So if there's a significant increase in volume, might that change the economics to have more equipment available for exporters, particularly westbound?
With regard to China, we're still in the midst of the phase one agreement, which called for fairly significant increases in exports by us, imports by China of American goods. The last I saw, that was sort of not happening to the extent that folks had hoped. I think in general, we may see a reduction in trade tensions in the short run might have some effect. I'm of the belief that, even if we sort of try to normalize our relationship with China from a trade standpoint, or Canada, or all the other places where the current administration has been creating a certain degree of tension, the underlying forces are not going to change. We're still going to disengage relative to where we are now from China. The only question is how fast and to what degree. So I don't see that turning around. And if there's one thing that I think the recent events should have demonstrated to importers, it's that you don't put all your eggs in one basket, whether that's a supplier or a nation. And so we're going to see continued diversification away. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't necessarily mean it's coming back here. It might go to Mexico, it might go to Vietnam, it might go a lot of different places. But I think that process is inexorable.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Here's one, someone compliments you on your beard. And what is your view of customers on basically the delays that are going on at customers on domestic containers and how that's affecting capacity? Basically using those containers as excess storage and taking them out of circulation. Do you think that plays into some of the constraints?
Well, I'm certain that it plays into the constraint. Any container that's sitting there being used as mobile storage is a container that's not available to move freight. If you have a private, and this is not unique to intermodal, it's also a situation with long haul truck. And if you have a private intermodal fleet, then typically that provider is in dialogue with the customer saying, hey, I need to get that container back, and if you don't give me back my containers, I won't be able to, and I will choose not to supply containers at the other end for your next load. So there's that kind of dialogue that happens. That becomes much more difficult in a rail-owned container fleet because of the separation of the ownership of the container and who's arranging for the movement and the dray, and all of those are different pieces that are trying to move information. So you don't have that central sort of clearinghouse, and so I think it becomes more difficult to sort of incent the necessary movement of the containers when you've got a fragmented arrangement like you do on the rail-owned fleet. At least here in the States, not so much in Canada, where the railroads actually retail and control the door-to-door move. Here they don't in the States. So there are some differences there.
Now that makes sense. Here's one from an import standpoint. The Northeast looks like it's moving up on the Southeast. Do you see the Northeast gaining share from the Southeast longer term?
Well, I don't know. I'd have to go back and look. In fact, why don't I just take a quick look here? I don't know that I agree with the basic premise, other than in the most recent month that you saw a real divergence in Northeast and Southeast. I think that might have been a one shot. Certainly it occurred, but the Southeast has been really pretty strong in terms of market share gains, and they are making a concerted effort to improve their inland connectivity with a lot of investments in rail, intermodal at the port and inland port. You know, some of their rail work is, I'm going to call it near intermodal. So they're doing those inland ports that are within the Southeast region, and you can see that effect in the Southeast, intra-Southeast numbers in ETSO. Those have really risen over the last few years as places like Greer and VPI and all of those inland ports, South Carolina, Georgia, Port of Savannah, are putting in these inland terminals. When we look at port share or regional port share, the question is every port has its region of influence. So if you're going to have a load that's going to be terminating in Metro New York area, well, obviously that's not going to come into Savannah, it's going to come into New York. Where the jump freight is, call it the jump ball freight, is the Midwest, sort of the national interior, and that's the part that all of these different routings are vying for, whether it's Western Canada or Southern Cal or Northeast or Southeast, and that's affected by a multitude of factors, including where is the freight coming from and originally. If it's coming from India, then it's going to come into the East Coast. It would never go back to the West Coast. That's the long way around. So as we're starting to shift where the freight is coming from, that has an effect. Now within the Northeast, Southeast, they're all vying for that inland freight. If the volume comes through the canal, then maybe it hits Savannah first and goes up that way. If it's coming in from the Mediterranean, in other words, from the east, maybe it goes to New York first. There's a lot of different moving parts to that question.
Fair enough. Here's one. We knew we were going to get some, but from your crystal ball perspective, what kind of impacts do you see the election having short term and long term?
I guess for one thing, typically the economy hates uncertainty. So regardless of the outcome, just having this major source of uncertainty removed, I think will be good, particularly since this go around, there seems to be an additional layer of whether or not the handover, if there is one, is going to occur smoothly. I just think that, the sort of the level of societal anxiety and economic anxiety is kind of abnormally high right now. So just having that behind us and knowing where the future lies, I think is a good thing. If the Trump administration continues on, then I think you have status quo. I don't really see, I don't see much change, and I think that in general, I've said this before, the ability of any administration, Democratic or Republican, to actually affect the course of the economy is considerably exaggerated in the national consciousness compared to what they really can do. So, I think the course of the economy is affected far more by other factors other than who wins the election. Now, if the Democrats take the White House, I think there are some potential implications in terms of regulatory, and most likely a resumption of a tighter regulatory stance with regard to trucking, which might involve, I think, an item that has a big implication that was on the agenda prior to the Trump administration, which is speed limiters. So to the extent that happens, I think that's probably an intermodal benefit. It may be, during the Trump administration, every week was infrastructure week, but nothing ever seemed to really happen. Now, maybe in the second term of a Trump administration or the first term of a Biden administration, we actually will see some movement on infrastructure. It makes sense from my standpoint because with interest rates at zero, there's no better time to borrow money, especially if it's going to provide a long-term benefit, than right now. And we certainly need the stimulus as we come out of this pandemic lockdown and the damage that it's incurred. So hopefully, regardless of who wins, we see some movement, some much needed movement on the infrastructure side. Now, from a Biden standpoint, I don't know if his love of rail extends beyond Amtrak to the freight railroads. If it does, that's probably not a bad thing from an intermodal perspective either. But so those are some what I'll call hopefully non-political or as objective as I can be views of what might happen.
Oh, that's great. Well, we're about 5 over, but I appreciate all the great questions that we had. Sorry we didn't get to all of them. Larry, thank you very much for all your work. I know that you put a lot into preparing for these and then sharing that info. So we really appreciate it. Folks, if you'd like more information about some of the things that Larry talked about today, you can get the data itself from either our data products, the Volume Analyzer, or the ETSO database. And as I said before, the Intermodal In-Depth product that Larry puts together is incredibly insightful and definitely worth the read. So if you're interested in that, head over to intermodal.org and look for the data and statistics tab, and that'll take you to all that information. Or you can just shoot us an email at info@intermodal.org. Again, I'd like to thank our annual gold sponsors for bringing this session to us today. They go the extra mile for us, and we really appreciate you supporting them. So thanks to all of them for their work. And with that, I would like to thank everybody for spending time with us today. Larry, thank you for your time. And I would say until next time, wear your masks, wash your hands, stay an appropriate distance from each other.
Stay well, folks.